When I arrived in the prison, screams from others greeted me. I had no idea where I was, and as consciousness returned to me, I found myself surrounded by agitated people. As I tried to make sense of my new surroundings, the thought of my constant pursuer was foremost in my mind. At first, I thought they were being attacked by the predator that was chasing me. Wrongly, I assumed it had followed me. I shouldered my rifle and began yelling for everyone to get down. Confused, acting on a fresh flood of adrenaline, I began turning in a circle to find my target. As I did this, I noticed everyone cowering in fear as I swept over their heads with the gun's muzzle. It was then that I noticed that they were all wearing black and white striped clothing, reminiscent of ancient prison garb. It also occurred to me that they looked more frightened of me than of whatever was eating them. Addled by the yelling, I hadn't bothered to examine my location. When I took a moment to do so, I found that I was still in a jail cell, but was now surrounded by prisoners. Prisoners who were cowering for their lives as I pointed my rifle at them. In an effort to decrease the chaos, I lowered my rifle and tried to tell everyone to calm down, that I didn't mean them any harm. They kept screaming, so I raised my voice to yell above them. After turning in a complete circle, it was obvious that the beast had not followed me, and that the disturbance had been caused by my sudden appearance. My best efforts at getting them to settle down were wasted, and after a few moments, an extremely loud klaxon began ringing. Shortly thereafter, uniformed jailers began filling the area outside the cell. Each one registered a look of shock as they saw me holding a rifle and wearing a gun belt. One of them stepped forward, his arm outstretched in a calm down motion. His uniform was a pair of dark green pants with a red stripe down the outside of each leg, and a dark green dress coat which boasted a very shiny copper badge. His hat resembled a pilot's, but had another smaller copper badge at the bridge. Around his waist he wore a shiny black leather belt, and a billy club swung from his hip as he walked. He said something to me, but I couldn't understand the language he spoke. Then he yelled something to the prisoners, who dutifully turned around and placed their hands on the bars. When he approached the cell door, again repeating his unintelligible comment or command, I tried to tell him that I didn't understand him. When I spoke, he took a couple of steps backwards, then repeated his command. Turning his head to yell something to his compatriots, I shouted, "English! Do you speak English?" He said some more of his gibberish to me, but this time pointed to my rifle. I finally understood that he wanted my rifle. I had instantly appeared in his lockup, armed to the teeth, and shouting in a foreign language. Where I come from, this is usually a prelude to a bomb being detonated. Understanding his fear and recognizing the gravity of my situation, I released the magazine and removed the round from the chamber, then slid the weapon through the iron bars to his feet. He kicked it further away, back towards the huddled masses of his fellow officers. By now there must have been 20 jailers in the room, dressed identically, but with no stripes on their pants. The only one speaking to me was the one with the red stripes. It didn't take long for me to figure out he was their leader. I tried to tell him I had knives and another firearm, but he didn't understand. He just kept walking forward, spouting his twisted language at me, trying to sound calming. I was worried that if he opened the door and found my other weapons, I would get a monumental beating. As he approached, I held up my hand and said, "Stop!" in a loud voice. I think the combination of hand gesture and yelling is what ceased his advance. I know it wasn't my words. With very slow movements, I took off my coat and pushed it through the bar. Then I slowly removed my pistol, which caused a new wave of shouting from the prisoners and guards. Again, I removed the magazine, racked the slide to eject the round, and then slid the pistol to him. Like before, he kicked it to his cohorts, but this time he waited to see what else I would produce. Next came the knives. He stood there staring at me, waiting to see if I was finished. So I turned my pants pockets inside out and raised my hands slowly, turning around. I got down on my knees and interlaced my fingers on top of my head. I heard the door slide open and was slammed to the ground, handcuffed, and drug out of the cell. The handcuffs were iron and heavy, definitely not modern as I would think of them. I was then patted down, and during this entire ordeal he was shouting commands at me, which to this day I still don't understand. I've picked up a few words since then, but not very many. After the fun and games of being pushed around and screamed at by Mr. Fancy Pants, I was taken to another room, where I was strip-searched. Following this insult, I was unceremoniously tossed into a different cell, along with most of my clothing. They had decided to keep my belt and shoelaces. I paced back and forth in that cell for hours and was finally given, through a small hatch in the door, a metal food tray. It was some kind of stew and mashed potatoes with a cup of coffee to drink. I finished that meal before I had time to walk to the back of the cell and sit down. After a day and a half of expired junk food, even penal cuisine was welcome. Every 15 minutes or so, a guard would look into the cell and try to talk to me. Each time they were given the same response. "My name is Richard Blackburn. I speak English, and I can't understand you." When it was time for dinner, I was given another tray of deliciously warm food, and I finished it in record time as well. For the next 2 days, I was confined to that cell. Food came at regular intervals, but as my stomach got used to being full, my desire to eat mystery meals waned. The facility I was held in seemed to be very old, with hand-hewn bricks making up the back wall and iron bars making up the individual cells. The cells were arranged along a long hallway which ended in a brick wall on one end and guardhouse at the other. More halls filled with more cells and hallways radiated from the center, where the guard shack was located. Oil lamps hung from the ceiling in the hallways outside the prisoners' cells. I thought New Arlington had been a technological backwater, but this prison was devoid of any hint of progress since the 1920s or maybe even earlier. The guards were cruel to the prisoners, beating them mercilessly for small offenses. Mr. Red Stripe seemed to be more humane, ending the beatings when he came across them, but not with any degree of haste. I was fortunate in that they left me alone for the most part. I've no idea what happened to the guns I surrendered to them, but I did hear some gunshots from outside the prison, and I assumed they were using them. One night, a guard woke me and pointed to the pistol, which still had its slide locked back. After some pantomime, I guessed he was asking me how to load it, and I motioned for him how to insert the magazine and rack the slide. He did just that, then pointed it at me. It amused him greatly when I was visibly afraid and raised my hands. He just lowered the pistol and walked away, laughing to himself. Shortly thereafter, I heard the sounds of pistol shots from outside. What I didn't know at the time was that they had a hard time determining what language it was that I spoke. Obviously, they had lots of questions for me, but my words sounded just as meaningless to them as theirs did to me. Eventually, they were able to find someone they thought could translate, but she was somewhere far off and took her time in getting there. As the sun was setting on day 3 of my incarceration, I was moved from my cell to an interview room where my hands were fastened to a metal table. After I was locked in place, an ancient-looking woman hobbled in and sat down across from me. When she spoke, it was with the strangest accent. It reminded me of a certain ethnic chef from a certain children's puppet show. I don't remember all of the details of the conversation, but it was very close to this. "Your name is Richard Blackburn, yes?" she asked. "Yes, and who are you?" You should have seen the delight in her face when I answered her. It was like she was a kid on Christmas morning. She turned to the guard and excitedly said something, and then turned back to me. "Are you learned English?" This took me a bit longer to understand, but finally I replied, "I've spoken English all my life. Now, would you please be so kind as to tell me your name?" "My name is Uner. I'm a linguist at our university in Lourdes," was her sing-song reply. "Pleased to meet you. Would you mind telling me where I am?" "Where do you think you are?" she asked. "I've no idea," I replied matter-of-factly. She told me I was in some place which I couldn't pronounce or spell if my life depended on it. To save my readers a lot of banter and myself a lot of writing, I will attempt to condense the contents of my conversation with Mrs. Uner. In that place, English is a dead language, deader even than Latin. The only people who speak it are linguists who study something called the sacred writings. She didn't offer to tell me what that was, and I didn't ask. She wanted to know how I got there. I did my best to explain everything to her. She didn't believe me, and I told her I didn't care if she believed me or not. She asked me about the guns. I told her where I got them. She didn't believe me, and I reiterated that I didn't care if she did or not. She asked me about my clothes, and I told her it was a mix of my uniform and things I had found at the previous place I'd been. Of particular interest to her was my profession. When I told her I was a pilot, she wanted to know what port I was based out of. When I told her Marienfeld, she asked which coast that was on. It became obvious to me that she thought I was the pilot of a tugboat or something. I clarified it was an airport, and she looked at me in the strangest way. Then she asked me if I knew about the murders that were happening in the prison. I professed my innocence until she mentioned the smell. I'm sure my face betrayed my feelings well before I started talking. She listened politely as I told her everything I knew about it, but I could tell she didn't believe me. I tried to tell her that it was after me, and that to save the lives of the people in the jail, she'd need to release me. As long as I was there, I told her, it would keep coming back. With a great degree of patronization, she thanked me for my time. Then, her two shaky legs carried her out of the room. Outside the door, I could hear hushed voices talking. I couldn't make out what they were saying even if they had been screaming at me, but they still felt the need to speak in whispers. I had assumed that when she left, I'd be taken back to my cell. Instead, there came a soldier accompanied by one of the prison staff. His dress uniform was worn to impress me, and if I had any idea what country or service he was in, his plan might have worked. Lacking that knowledge, however, it looked to me like an over-the-top Revolutionary War costume. I was just barely able to keep myself from chuckling. He pulled his seat out, produced a cigarette, offered me one, which I took, and then lit them both with a match. The damn thing tasted like it was 50 years old, but I was glad to have something which reminded me of my old home. With a great display of secretiveness and selectivity, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a pen and ink drawing of an altimeter. After such a show of selecting just the right picture, but not allowing me to see the other contents in his attaché, I was expecting something really shocking. But a picture of an altimeter was a letdown. He tapped his forehead, then pointed to the picture. I nodded that yes, I did indeed know what that was. Another grandiose act followed with him producing a different drawing. This time it was a directional gyro, but was severely damaged. Again, I indicated I knew what he was showing me. When he started rummaging through his precious briefcase, I asked him for a pen and motioned with my hands that I wanted to write. After some mental deliberation and looking up and down for his answer, I think I really threw him off by interrupting his own personal kabuki show. Anyway, he handed me a pencil which appeared to be handmade and a thick sheet of paper. I rolled my eyes and then looked at my bound hands. The soldier pointed to my handcuffs and spoke his sing-song language at the guard, who grunted and then released my restraints. "Prepare to be amazed, Sergeant Pepper," I said as I started drawing the 6 standard instruments in any airplane. I started with the altimeter and DG because that's what he had shown me. Then I filled in the airspeed indicator, the vertical speed indicator, turn coordinator, and attitude indicator. To further annoy my silent interrogator, I drew a rudimentary pedostatic system, vacuum pump, and battery to indicate which instruments ran off of what systems. When I looked up, his hand was covering his mouth, his eyes were wide, and his free hand was shaking as he picked up my drawing. Gathering up his precious pictures, he did not stop staring at my crude illustration. In fact, even as he left the room, his eyes were fixed on that piece of paper. Leaving in such a rush left the guard confused. He kept looking at me, then out in the hall, then back at me. 10 minutes or so passed, and my guard decided it was time for me to go back to my cell. That cell door hadn't even been closed a minute when it opened again, and in walked Mrs. Uner and the over-the-top soldier. "You're gonna go with the marshal here," she said. "Oh, really?" "Yes, they seem to think you're knowing something special." "And my things?" I still can't believe I had the nerve to ask for my things back, but I did. I don't know. Her voice trailed off. Let me go and ask. When she returned, she had everything but my weapons in a large duffel bag. Thinking of them as souvenirs, I smiled and accepted them. So I'm still under arrest? Take a good look. I don't know, and yes, I suppose. Good luck, Mr. Blackburn. Then she turned and walked out. Behind her was the marshal, who beckoned for me to follow him, which of course I did. It was a welcome change to get out of that cell, and just walking more than 6 feet seemed to be an indulgence. As we approached the guard shack in the middle of the prison, I shouldered the duffel bag and noticed the man with the red stripes was there to meet me. Trying to speak with me again, I was unable to comprehend his words, but Mrs. Unner translated that he wanted to know if he could have the long, slender knife. He was, of course, talking about the fillet knife. I sensed an opportunity to warn him about my constant hunter and told him, through Mrs. Unner, that he was more than welcome to the knife if he listened to what I had to say. He excitedly nodded his head in agreement. What Mrs. Unner was supposed to tell him was that it was not a man who was killing people in the prison, but rather some kind of animal that was specifically there to kill me. I said that the smell meant he was near and that I was the one who had scarred its face with a hot fire poker. Finally, I warned him that it learned quickly and was relentless and strong, but not unbeatable. Mrs. Unner, obviously not wanting to traffic in fairy tales, said only 3 or 4 words to the jailer. I was furious with her and demanded that she tell him everything. Then she just smiled and pretended that she no longer understood English. Anger was rising in me at my inability to force her to translate, when I smelled it again. Down one of those halls, that thing was skulking around. Then I heard the screams. It was one at first, then 2 people. The fear in their voices was clear. From the same direction as the screams came a loud whistle, and that made guards appear from every part of the prison and run towards the commotion. Even Mr. Red Stripes ran toward the scuffle, useless billy club in his hand. The soldier, the old lady, and I simply stood there. They had no idea what to do, so they decided to just stand there like idiots. I begged Mrs. Unner to tell the soldier that I needed my guns, that it was the only hope for us to stay alive, but again she played dumb. The screaming increased in intensity, and one lone scream could be heard getting louder and louder, then fading into nothing as a guard ran past. He was holding his severed left arm in his right hand. Blood was spraying in massive bolts from his torn body until he fell to the ground and was silent. One voice after another, the screaming subsided. The smell only got stronger, and the combination of silence and stench told me that it was done devouring the guards. Ignoring the worthless old woman, I grabbed the soldier, diverting his gaze from the lifeless guard. When he looked at me, I acted out holding a rifle and pointing it in the direction from which the man had come. He stood up straighter, then grabbed me by the arm and started running toward a door at the far end of a hall. Whether Mrs. Unner either chose to stay where she was out of fear or stupidity is irrelevant. She stayed. Her inaction caused her to come face to face with my own personal boogeyman. When we reached the door, the soldier began banging on it, yelling in his language. There, trapped at the end of a hallway next to a locked door, I watched as it slaughtered her. As it circled the old woman, I could see it had increased in size by at least a foot or 2. It still had the scar from my fire poker over its right eye, though. The beast first looked at her, and then directly at me. Its curved jaw opened slowly, and Mrs. Unner stood there frozen in fear. With preternatural speed, it closed its mouth around her left leg, slicing it off like it was pruning a human bush. The woman fell on her right side, a geyser of blood spraying from her hip, a primal scream escaping her lips. She held up her hands in a defensive way, and with the greatest of ease, the hunter clipped off those as well. She rolled onto her stomach, blood spraying from her wrists now as she tried to crawl on her elbows toward me and yelled in English, "Help me!" "I can't." Those were the only words I could muster. That was my sorrowful response. Then that horrible monster walked around the dying woman and sat on her back. Her bones snapped like dry twigs. Slowly, it opened its mouth again, and this time placed it around her neck. I was staring directly in her eyes, watching her fear shoot into me like a laser beam.
The beast then shifted its gaze toward me as it slowly closed its mouth. The damn thing was making me watch while it tortured her. I saw it wink its left eye at me as it separated her head from her body. It winked at me. That's when I knew without a doubt that it was not just an animal, but that it was playing with me for its own amusement. Behind me, the soldier pulled me through the door, and a jailer closed it and barred it. There was excited banter between the soldier and the jailer, but again, I have no idea what was discussed. The conversation was cut short by a loud bang on the door behind us. It must have been throwing its full weight against the solid door. Mortar from the brick joints began to crumble, drifting in the air like a fine powder. The jailer reached for the bar laying across the door, and the soldier punched him in the face, dropping him like so much dead weight. I think he may have actually killed him because I didn't see that man get up. Again, the soldier grabbed me under my arm, quickly marching me through a set of double doors which led out into the night. Behind us, the rhythmic pounding grew louder and louder. Once outside, I had expected to see a parking lot, but there was nothing of the sort. Instead, there was a dirt road leading away from the front door of the prison and a hitching post with several horses tied to it. The horses were straining against their leads to get away from the prison and the commotion inside. The soldier quickly untied I assume it was his horse, and another as well. As he mounted his animal, the door in the prison gave way with a great resounding bang. The uproar spooked both the untied animals, causing the soldiers to rear up, but the unmounted horse bolted straight down the dirt road. Without any delay, the man reached his hand out to me and hauled me onto the back of his mount. Giving a command, he kicked his heels against the horse's flank, and we began our getaway at breakneck speed. I watched as the demon ran after us. At first, it was able to keep pace with us, even gain a little ground. After a minute or so of both the horse and the monster running at full speed, the distance between us began to open. When it realized it wasn't going to be able to catch me, it stood on its hind legs and yowled unnaturally. In doing so, I could appreciate the terrible growth of that thing. If it had been that big when I first saw it, I would have been dead long ago. Our retreat took us through a beautiful landscape lit by the moon. The road went over rolling hills through a forest of huge pine trees dotted with occasional aspen groves. The horse galloped for as long as it could, but then slowed to a canter. The soldier who had rescued me was muttering to himself constantly. Eventually, the horse refused to canter, and we slowed even more. The marshal kept looking back over his shoulder, scanning the night for any hint of the animal who had just slaughtered countless men. I pointed to my nose and shook my head. I could see him think about this for a moment, and then he visibly relaxed. Through the night we rode, then, at some point, we came to a fork in the road and went left. This trail led us along the bank of a large lake and to a fort of some kind. Made of brick on the first story and then large timber construction for the second, the fort looked to have been recently constructed. The trunks of freshly cut trees encircling the installation attested to my assumption. As we passed inside its gates, I saw enormous cannons and heard what sounded like a generator in the distance. Electric lights were strung along the main road, illuminating our path. A flag, which resembled a Union Jack but with a large red circle in the middle, was being raised as the sky began to glow in the morning's first light. Upon dismounting, we were met by several people wearing uniforms similar to the soldier I had been traveling with. There was typical military cordiality, and when they saluted each other, it was by placing the back of their open hands against their foreheads. The way the people from the fort greeted us, it was apparent that I was traveling with a man of very high rank. Fully expecting to be placed back in manacles, I was surprised when I was instead shown to a brick cabin and given blankets and water in a large ceramic pitcher. I made my bed, and while doing so, considered trying to run from the fort. I decided against it because these people were soldiers with guns. Well, actually they looked more like muskets. Anyway, I believed there was no safer place for me. Besides that, even if I did run, where would I run to? I imagine this is why I was not thrown in jail again. They knew I would have nowhere to run. In any event, even if I had wanted to, I would have been stopped at the door by the guard who was placed there. I discovered him when I went outside to find a bathroom. He was sitting right outside my door, and when I opened it, he leapt to his feet and faced me. My tale of needing to find a bathroom was ignored because, like everyone else I saw, no one spoke English. I crudely imitated relieving myself, and he motioned for me to follow him to the privy. It was a group outhouse, but the smell was controlled somehow. I want to write this part because I find it fascinating. In the evening of the following day, I saw a soldier, most likely of low rank, walk to the outhouse with a bucket and pour it down an access hatch in the side. In the afternoon, the smell had begun to increase, but as soon as he poured that mysterious liquid in it, it subsided. Anyway, after I was done, I was led back to my cabin, where I lay down and slept for a few hours. It was some time after this that the marshal appeared at my door. He was not wearing his dress uniform, having traded it for riding pants and suspenders. He looked as though he had not slept at all since we last met. Again he tried speaking with me, but both he and I ended up being frustrated. Then he provided me with a pencil and paper and motioned that I should watch him. He mimed turning a crank and then put his 2 fingers together, making a zzz sound. My only response was to hold my hands up in confusion. Moving toward the door, he motioned for me to follow, and of course I did. He led me to a shack in the middle of the fort. Inside the roughly hewn walls was a modern generator. It was grimy with age, and with the muffler gone, it was extremely loud. Pointing at it, I nodded my head and yelled to him that it was a generator. Then he moved to the front of the machine and pointed at its control panel. It was written in English. I stood there dumbfounded for several moments. Why would they make something and label it in a dead language? It would be like us making a machine and then labeling it in Sumerian. Then I realized that this machine might be a remnant of a time gone by. Clearly, it had been around for decades, probably longer, but how something that old could still be functioning was beyond me. Pointing at the name stenciled in faded black, my would-be benefactor opened and closed his other hand in front of his mouth. Screaming out loud to be heard, I yelled, "Power Station 414." With shock surely registering on my face, I looked up to see him smiling triumphantly. He laughed and heartily hugged me, then led me back to my cabin with a quickening pace. I remained there, under guard, for the rest of the day, observing the operations of his military from the covered porch area. When my dinner was brought to me, it was truly fit for a king. I was beginning to understand that the marshal wanted me for something. This land seemed to be devoid of anyone who spoke English, yet used machines made long ago by English speakers. I had a feeling I was going to be used as some sort of living technological Rosetta Stone. Perhaps that place had suffered some sort of catastrophe, causing a loss of social history and memory. I was utterly confused, yet intrigued. Late in the night, I heard the screams of men and smelled the odor again. This time, however, the screams were ordered and punctuated by musket shots. In the midst of the commotion, my door flung open and a squad of soldiers dragged me out of bed, depositing me roughly on the floor in the middle of the room. I was sure they were going to execute me right there. Instead, they turned their attention away from me, pointing their muskets toward the windows and taking up covered firing positions. There was no triumphant jubilation at the conclusion of what I can only guess was a skirmish with the wretched creature. Volleys of gunfire slowed to a trickle, then stopped. Another soldier barked orders at the men in my cabin, who then left without saying a word. These men had been dispatched to protect me from the animal, not to kill me. Whatever knowledge was in my head was worth more to the marshal than the lives of these men. To be honest, I was starting to feel pretty important myself. Perhaps I could help these people reclaim their long-lost heritage. Perhaps I could be a sort of savior to them. Maybe, if they were able to kill this monstrosity tormenting me, I wouldn't have to leave. Maybe I had a chance at peace. In the morning, I was awakened by a loud knock at my door. I tried to dress quickly, but the marshal was not willing to wait, and I had just gotten my pants on when he let himself in. Behind him, and pushed into the cabin by 2 soldiers, was a woman. Her face was bruised and swollen, and she did not look up at anyone. If she had not been so badly beaten, she would have been radiantly beautiful. He motioned for me to sit, and I did as I buttoned up my shirt. Yes, I was still wearing my uniform shirt. The marshal had even arranged for it to be cleaned and folded neatly. He then pushed the woman into the chair opposite mine. After some talking between the marshal and the woman, he abruptly raised his fist to strike her. Reflexively, I grabbed his wrist, which turned out to be a bad idea. Instead of unleashing his blow on the woman, he proceeded to headbutt me, causing me to fall backwards. Once on the ground, he punched and kicked me repeatedly in a most savage fashion. Not being a man to suffer these assaults unmatched, when I realized what was happening, I jumped to my feet and prepared to fight back. But the muskets of the guards were all pointed at me, so I thought better of it. Then she spoke clearly and without accent. "If you fight back, they will kill you." That got my full attention, and the marshal pushed me back into my seat. "Who are you?" I asked. "My name is Iranen," she said. "You think you are safe here, but you are not. When they are done with you, they will kill you." I am so confused. "What am I doing here?" I asked. "You are a guest of the Imperial Marshal. You are here to serve his needs." "Are you his guest as well?" "No, I am his victim." The marshal spoke to her in a heated tone, slamming his fist on the table. "He wants to know if you know how the machine works," she resumed. "You mean the machine in the shed, the generator?" "I don't know what it's called, but yes, the thing that makes fireless light." "More or less, I mean. I couldn't build one, but I can tell you how it basically works." Iranen then relayed the message to the marshal, who then handed me a pencil and some paper. "He wants you to draw it." I drew a simple illustration of a coil and 2 magnets, and a voltage diagram. Then I proceeded to point at random points on my illustration and talk to her. My goal was to be able to speak without the marshal knowing that my conversation was not limited to my schematic. "It's just a wire spinning in a magnetic field. What happened here? Why do you have machines with English markings that you can't understand? If you speak English, why don't you translate for him?" "So then it is true. You are a traveler like the one who rode a metal bird." "I don't know what the hell that means. I'm not from here, if that's what you're getting at. Hell, I don't even know where here is," I said as I pointed to another part of my drawing. "I speak the sacred language, as did my mother and her mothers before her for generations. But I know not of the wells of knowledge, the books," she said. She was catching on, phrasing her response with the inflection of a question and pointing at the diagram. "More wires means more constant power," I said, and then continued. "So you can't read, but surely you must know about these machines, where they came from. How are they still running?" "There is one man who knows the wells, the king's scribe. 'Tis the king who the marshal is fighting. The scribe is the one who fixed a few of them using his great knowledge. No one but he and his advisors are allowed to even look at the sacred writings." My memory for the exact words is failing me, but between answering questions for the marshal, I was able to keep up the subterfuge and have a lengthy conversation with Iranen regarding the current state of political affairs and my own predicament. The marshal had been the most victorious general in the king's army, and thus had garnered great favor with him. Having won many hard battles under the king's banner, his latest campaign took him deep into savage territory where the marshal was encamped. Not far from the fort where I was being cordially confined, on the southernmost tip of the southernmost peninsula, the marshal had found a great ship wrecked on the shore. What was inside the ship is not known, but it was of such great significance that it caused the marshal to ignore the king's order to return to the capital. Instead, he and his entire army had started an insurrection. Having established control over the area surrounding the shipwreck through his previous conquests, it was with great interest to the marshal when he heard about the English speaker who suddenly appeared in his prison. He was told I had arrived holding strange and powerful weapons and with clothing bearing English letters. Unnur, the now dead ancient woman, according to Iranen, was one of the marshal's foremost expert on the sacred writings. She had been chosen by the marshal to interview me and determine if I did indeed speak English. Once it was discovered that I was not only an English speaker, but a native one at that, my release from the prison and conscription into his service had been assured. The interview, or interrogation depending on how you look on it, went on for the rest of the day. Not stopping for breakfast or lunch, the marshal wanted to know everything about where I was from and the technologies there. I provided him with as much information as he wanted, sketching for him the basics of internal combustion engines, generators, hydraulic pumps, airfoils, and ammunition. That is by far not a complete list, but I can't remember everything he demanded information on. As the sun began to disappear, the marshal surprised me as he was preparing to leave. "Thank you, Captain Blackburn," said the marshal in clear English. The tempo with which he spoke betrayed the fact that he was taking great care to pronounce every syllable correctly. "You are welcome," was the reflexive answer I gave. My shock in hearing him speak in an understandable fashion soon turned to curiosity. Wanting to know just how much English he understood, I followed it up with a nonsense statement. "I like the provocative sky today. Are you in the mood for withering teeth?" Iranin looked at me in the most confused way, but the marshal just nodded and smiled. While my translator was still staring at me, I waved to her and asked her to think of a way for us to escape. Then she smiled from ear to ear. Her piercing blue eyes seemed to have more life in them in that moment than in the entirety of our conversation. "He only knows the polite saying he just said. He made me teach it to him last night," Iranin said to me while smiling and waving back at me. That night, I dined well. Several slices of beef, vegetables, fruit, and a sweet, albeit hard cake. This was the marshal's reward for cooperating with him. My bruised ribs and swollen face attested to the cost of resistance. The age-old carrot-and-stick adage made all too real. My opinion of my captor had diminished. Although I had nowhere to go, I hoped Iranin would be able to help us escape. As luck would have it, an opportunity did present itself. Arriving before the morning's first light, the marshal, through Iranin, bid me get dressed, gather my things, and follow him. Outside my cabin, a company of cavalrymen were awaiting us. Iranin, the marshal, and I took a position at the head of the column. Fresh bruises could be seen on Iranin's face, but I knew that any physical altercation between the woman-beating marshal and I would have been suicide. I held my tongue and my fists, but the anger inside me rose every time I looked at her battered face. I asked her if she was okay, and she relayed that she was beaten for refusing to lay with one of the marshal's captains. Were it not for her language abilities, they surely would have killed her. Through Iranin, the marshal told me that we had a long journey ahead of us, through land held by uncivilized savages who would most certainly kill all of us given the opportunity. When I asked him where we were going, his reply was, "South." On his command, the entire column began moving in the same direction, with 6 riders moving ahead of the columns with such speed that they soon were no longer visible. These were the scouts, sent out ahead of the main force to reconnoiter the territory ahead. Traveling with mounted soldiers would have been much easier for me if I had any idea how to ride a horse. Fording 2 rivers and traversing rugged terrain was a horrible way to learn the basics. The saddles they used were certainly not designed for comfort, and by noon I was no longer aware of any sensation in my legs. Shortly thereafter, our party was ascending a rocky path, where I fell from my saddle, landing on sharp rocks which tore into my shoulder and sent scarlet streams of blood down my arm. When I arose, one of the soldiers found my situation more than a little amusing, and laughed loudly while pointing at me. His laughing was cut short by the hasty arrival of the advanced scouting party. I, at first, was not nervous by their return. Several times during our ride, 1 or 2 of them would return and advise the marshal to turn the column one way or the other. This time, however, they returned with several apparently riderless horses. Instead of calmly approaching the column, they were screaming and gesturing wildly. As they drew closer, I could see the horses were not, in fact, without riders. The bodies of their former riders were limp and bloodied, laying prone across their saddles. What I assume was a call to arms was played on a bugle, and the column dissolved briefly into confusion, reforming itself into a semicircle and advancing to the top of the ridge with lightning speed. In their haste to meet the threat, Iranin and I were left behind. While she did not say anything, her gaze did not leave the ridgeline, and terror registered on her face. I remember I asked her if we should attempt to escape while the soldiers were occupied. Not daring to turn away from her vigil, she just shook her head no. The panic in her began to seep its way into me, because I realized she felt safer with men who beat and raped her regularly than with whatever was coming toward us. My own assessment of the situation was somewhat different than Erinen's. Both my captor and whatever frightening force was coming to meet him lay ahead of me. Behind me, however, lay rivers which might be fast enough to speed me toward emancipation. My plan, which I had formed crossing the second river, was to fall into the river and remain submerged for as long as possible. I was praying that I would be swept enough distance downstream to escape before anyone noticed my tumble was not an accident. Now, with their attention turned toward the threat, there would be no need to play at drowning. With all concerned parties now staring toward the south, I clumsily climbed aboard my horse and turned him to the north. I wasted no more time trying to convince Irinen to flee with me and dug my heels into the animal's flanks. Wind rushing around my ears made the sounds of musket shot less piercing, but they were still very loud. The battle had begun, and I encouraged my horse to move even faster. It wasn't long until I was descending into the river valley which I had pinned my hopes of escape on. Nearing the edge of the river, a familiar foul odor assaulted my nose. Before I could consciously register the danger, I found myself traveling through the air without my horse. I had been thrown several feet into the air when the beast pounced upon my animal. The creature had been following me, and I had raced right back to it. My poor horse had been felled, its throat torn open by the arched mouth of my constant harasser. As luck would have it, I landed in the river and found myself in the perfect position to execute my plan. Rather than attempting to escape the marshal, I was now trying to evade the monstrosity which tracked me everywhere. The cold of the fast-moving river made me want to inhale, and I had to fight this desire to keep from filling my lungs with near-freezing water. I felt the current pulling me downriver at an alarming rate, but I forced myself to remain under the surface for as long as I could hold my breath. Aiding me in this was my duffel bag, which miraculously was still slung across my back, and did a fair job of weighing me down. With the need for oxygen causing my lungs to burn with great force, I slowly raised my head and took a deep breath. I was careful to only remain on top for the time it took to take a few breaths, and while doing so, I scanned the riverbanks for the monster. The river was moving more swiftly than I had hoped, and I was able to catch a glimpse of the demented thing which had slaughtered my horse before a bend in the river removed him from my field of vision. Angrily splashing in the river, searching for me, it appeared to be quite upset that I had eluded it yet again. Fortunately for me, the subterfuge held up to the animal's scrutiny, and I was carried by the river for miles. Had the water been warmer, I would have gladly let the tributary carry me for as long as there was daylight. When the cold was no longer tolerable, I swam to the north bank and began drying myself out. In the interest of complete honesty, I will tell you that what I did was strip to my underwear and shoes, keeping my clothing draped on top of me. It was a rather uncomfortable way to travel as I made my way along the riverbank, but my clothing was mostly dry in a couple of hours, and just as the sun was setting, I was able to put them back on. That night, I found shelter in a natural cave along the bank of the river I had used for my escape. It wasn't more than 30 feet in length, but it possessed an unusual S-shape, which I used to my advantage. I imagined that the marshal would be, by now, either victor or loser in his skirmish, and if he had been the victor, he most certainly would have sent out search parties to find me. Wanting to not be noticed by him, his enigmatic adversary, or the hell spawn which wanted to eat me, I decided to make my camp in the deepest part of the cave. I was able to make a small fire using a cigarette lighter I liberated from the gas station, and deadfall wood from the forest outside. The natural turning of the cavern prevented the light from traveling out. I made a bed out of dry leaves gathered from the surrounding area, and before sleeping, I gathered more firewood and piled rocks up to make a barrier at the mouth of the cave. Fortunately, the ceiling of the cave sloped upward at enough of an angle to allow the smoke from my fire to escape. The mouth of the grotto was sufficiently small to assure the beast would not be able to squeeze in. It was by no means comfortable, but it did provide enough peace of mind that I was able to sleep. When I awoke the next morning, I found myself in a different state of mind. I was angry about my situation. I was becoming tired of running from that infernal animal. Determined to take control of my future, I set about constructing a deadfall trap at the mouth of the cave. Using fallen tree limbs, I created a platform above the entrance and then loaded it with as many rocks as I could fit on top. The trigger mechanism was quite simple. A vertical brace supported the overhanging rocks, which, when kicked or pushed over, would cause the whole assembly to fall. The trigger was placed next to the entrance, so I would have no problem springing the trap. Furthermore, I used the laces from my shoes to attach a stone from the river to a branch which had a natural Y shape. I thought that if the trap only wounded the animal, then I would be able to bludgeon it while it was trapped under the stone. Construction of my demon crusher and cudgel took most of the morning and left me exhausted, so I crawled back into the cave to rest. As I was drifting into unconsciousness, I thought I heard voices. Alarmed, I quickly rose and listened intently. My hearing was dulled, however, by the resurgence of ringing in my ears. I almost felt cheated. If I left this place soon, I would not be able to use the trap I had so fervently worked to create. Over the noise in my ears, I was able to just barely make out voices, growing louder. I could pick out at least 2 voices, one male and one female. My heart sank when I heard the distinctive sound of horse hooves. I imagined the marshal's men surrounding the cave. What I had first seen as a place of safety now seemed to be my trap. Outside, I heard a bugle playing the same call to arms I had heard yesterday. The hoofbeats quickened and grew noisier. I stared out of my cave, hoping to see something which would give me a clue as to where the marshal's forces were and what they were up to. A blurry form ran across my viewpoint. It was human, but it wasn't one of the marshal's soldiers. I shook my head in disbelief as another, and then another ran past my cave, crossing from left to right with silent speed. One of the forms stopped directly in front of the entrance, but outside the deadfall. His gaze pointed in the direction of his associates. He was a mass of sinew and muscle with a head that was shaved completely and painted jet black from the top of his ears up and blood red from the ears down. Wearing animal skin breeches and clutching a curved mace, he was the image of stalking death. Sensing me watch him, he quickly turned his head to the cave. Then he studied my trap, his eyes moving from the vertical post to the mass of rocks above. When he turned further to face me, his expression left no room for me to imagine a peaceful outcome. Grasping my bludgeon, I bladed my body towards him, lowering my center of gravity and tensing my muscles. Our eyes locked, and we stared at each other for a few moments. Rather than charge me, he turned and continued the direction he had been traveling. Musket shots rang out so close that their report made me jump in my skin. Following the shots, I could hear the war cries of the warriors. The bugling started again, only to be cut short after the first few notes. A pitched battle was going on right outside my hiding place. Vicious screaming and musket shots created an unholy and terrifying cacophony. The sounds of battle continued for a brief time, then silence, and then a lone musket shot. Being a cautious man, I waited for some while before venturing outside. Carnage is not enough to describe the scene I walked into in that clearing. Dead men and horses lay strewn across half an acre. There was so much blood that I could taste it just by breathing. My laceless shoes became filled with the exsanguination of men and animals alike, and soon slipped off my feet. In my bare, blood-covered feet, I walked from man to man, checking for a pulse. Those with obviously fatal wounds, like crushed skulls, I ignored. There were dozens or so in that state. There was not one man left living that I could see. Shock over the brutality of what was all around me soon faded. I recognized that there were many weapons laying all around. And, with the beast still out there, I searched for dry powder and musket balls. A flintlock musket was added to my belongings. I also found a large knife with a deer antler handle. With my hands and feet crimson with the blood of the dead, I continued searching the bodies. Curiously absent was the marshal. He had made a retreat with a very few soldiers. I presume Iranen was with him as well. With everyone dead, I didn't understand why he had chosen to retreat. In the distance, on the horizon, I could see the dirt kicked up from their galloping horses hanging in the air. The night was absolutely still, and the buzzing of flies began to increase in volume. From the mass of death, I heard a squishing, sucking sound and turned to see the warrior who had stared at me earlier. He was crawling out from under several of the marshal's dead soldiers, or rather, he was trying to. I walked up behind him, then circled around to the front. His eyes were wide with anger, and his shouts were probably not very complimentary of me. I was still holding the knife and was covered in blood. Standing over him, holding a weapon, I must have looked like I was there to finish him off. Behind me, riding towards us, were more of his compatriots. I was unaware of this, and I am ashamed to say that I very nearly did plunge the knife into his back. I didn't need any more enemies in this land, and based on our mutual glance earlier, I was sure he wasn't my friend. In hindsight, perhaps killing him would have been the best option, but humanity won my mental battle, and I made a great show of putting my knife back in its scabbard and then reaching for him to take my hand. I hoped that by helping him, he would not kill me when he was free. This man was obviously accustomed to war and close combat, two things which I have no experience with. At any rate, I held my hand just out of reach until he stopped yelling at me. When he did, I moved closer, and he grabbed my arm. Grunting and straining, I was able to pull him out from under the dead men. For a few moments, I wasn't sure what his intentions were. The bloody warrior muttered to himself while he circled me, sizing me up. I kept his gaze while he did so, but didn't say anything. Soon enough, he stopped pacing and muttering. He lifted his head to look behind me and raised a fist to the sky. From behind me, a raucous chorus of yelling and hooting startled me. I turned to see roughly 50 of his tribesmen approaching on horseback. Their leader was wearing a feathered headdress which stretched to below the man's waist. I found myself in between what appeared to be a Native American war party and one of their braves. If you, the reader, are now rolling your eyes in disbelief, fear not, for that was my reaction as well. I don't know how I didn't pick up on the warrior's appearance, but in the stress of the moment and the horror of the carnage, I didn't connect the dots. Sadly, I know too little about the tribes of America to discern if it was one tribe or another. For that matter, would the tribes be the same in the world I was in? I doubt it very much. Exhausted and covered in blood, I felt my time on the battleground had expired, so I started walking back to the cave. I waved a friendly, I hoped, goodbye and started walking toward the direction from which I had come. I was scanning the ground looking for my blood-soaked shoes, so I didn't see the solitary brave move to block my path. I retrieved my footwear but couldn't bring myself to put them on. I was planning on washing them in the river near my cave, but the red and black painted warrior had other ideas. He shouted something at me, and I looked up to see that he had placed himself at the edge of the clearing, and the others had dismounted and fanned out in a semicircle behind me. A frustrated anger took hold of me. I was sick at being at someone else's beck and call. "Get the fuck out of my way," I said in a challenging voice as I approached him. He screamed something at me and gesticulated wildly towards the sky. "Don't care. Get the fuck out of my way," I yelled and made a broad, sweeping motion with my arm. Yet again he raised his voice and motioned wildly. "Jibber jabber jibber jabber jibber jabber," I yelled and mimicked his hand movements. The anger was becoming almost blinding. I remember wishing I had a pistol to shoot him in the face with. Instead, all I had was a knife, which I proceeded to draw as I continued to close the distance with him. When I drew the knife, his expression changed from incredulous for a moment, and then he started laughing and pointing behind me. I wouldn't have looked, but I heard wet footsteps behind me, and there, within striking distance, was another warrior, mace in hand, grinning wildly. Quickly, he raised his weapon to attack. I tried to roll out of the way, but he corrected his swing for my movement, and the mace struck me on the forehead. At least, I assume it did. I don't actually remember being struck, but when I came to, my situation had significantly deteriorated, and my forehead ached. The next memory I have is cold water splashing on my face and awaking to find myself tied to a tree, my arms bound in a most painful fashion, wrist to wrist, behind said tree. To the left of me were two of the marshal's men tied in the same fashion. We were in their camp. A roaring bonfire burned in the center. with men dancing and singing and circling it. The man who had thrown water on my face was the same man who had incapacitated me. He smiled, showing me a mouthful of broken and yellow teeth before joining his tribesmen in dancing around the fire. I could see their mouths moving and could hear the bass of their voices in my bones, but I was not able to hear them per se. The ringing noise in my ears was blocking out their chanting and caterwauling. It was the noise which told me I would soon not be tethered to a tree, but rather somewhere else. With great ceremony, they brought out our possessions and piled them at our feet. The apparent chief, the same one who had been on horseback earlier, stepped up to each of us in turn. He proceeded to sling the soldiers' packs and their guns around the trapped men's necks. Next, the chief placed the strap of my duffel bag around my neck and then shoved my rock and stick combo into my shirt. I guess they forgot my shoes, though. For a moment, I held hope that they were going to release us. That quickly changed. I don't really want to write this part, but I'm trying to put as much information in these notebooks as possible. I feel like it's my duty. The chief produced a curved knife and cut off the ear of the first soldier. As if that wasn't bad enough, he showed it to the man before eating it. The man was screaming wildly, and the chief answered his yells by cutting his other ear off and tossing it into the bonfire. The tribesmen hooted with great delight when he did this. Next, the man's nose went into the fire, again to much jubilation. I shut my eyes and prayed that the man would die quickly. With my eyes closed, the ringing sound in my ears increased, and all I could hear was the noise of my impending travel. I was thankful for it this time. I couldn't hear the screaming anymore, and the rising pain made it hard to think about what was happening. When I opened my eyes, I saw the mutilation had continued unabated. The poor man's scalp had been removed, and the chief was slowly cutting into his captive's throat. Finally, the young man hung limp. He was either passed out or dead, but either way, his pain was over. As the ringing became more insistent, I smelled the return of my old enemy. It was faint, but growing strong. I couldn't contain my contempt for the savagery unfolding before me any longer. "You're all going to die," I yelled at the top of my lungs. Then I couldn't stop myself from laughing. This got their attention, and the chief fixed his gaze on me as he walked to the next soldier. "Oh yes, you too, Big Bird. You're going to be eaten alive by something much worse than you can imagine." "Oh, you are so fucked," I said while laughing like a maniac. "I come from a place with wonders beyond your imagination. I would have helped anyone who asked me for it, but instead you idiots thought it best to tie me to a tree and kill me. You deserve what's coming." Then I turned toward the forest around us and continued, "I'm right here, you motherfucker. Come get me. But first, eat these assholes. Hurry up, because I'm leaving soon." The remaining soldier looked at me with fear and shock and then yelled to me. I was just barely able to make out his words. "Take me with you. I'm Iranin's brother, please." I was shocked to hear English words come from his mouth. Even more shocked that he claimed to be Iranin's brother. I am sure that there is a hell of a backstory there, but sadly I will never know it. Before I could answer him, the beast made a grand appearance. Lumbering straight for me, its powerful jaws bisected anyone unfortunate enough to be in its way. The pain between my temples began to be unbearable. I knew I would travel soon. I called back, "Where I go, no one can follow me except the monster." When he heard my reply, defeat and sorrow filled his face where a pleading hope had once been. The chief ran towards me, knife in hand, his fancy headdress flapping wildly as he ran. In his haste to end my life, he made a horrible mistake. He placed himself between the beast and I. Before I left the marshal's world, I watched with a smile as the chief's head disappeared in the animal's jaws. A fine red mist was left around its closed mouth. This time, the creature got so close to me, I was able to see down its throat. Through my mental agony, I was able to discern that it has 3 eyes in the back of its throat. Each one has a different shaped pupil. One like a reptile's, one like a lamb's and one like a man's. I saw this just before it started to close its mouth around my head. Time, in this instance, was on my side. A fraction of a second longer in that place, and I would have never left.